Infrastructure has a problem. People want amazing transport links, great houses, and super fast connectivity. But when you start building the railway, the airport, the road, or the data center, the energy changes. And this happens all over the world. Everyone wants it built, but nobody wants it here. Infrastructure projects are often described as being held back by one type of person, the NIMBY, the not in my backyard people. Someone who wants the benefits of a new infrastructure project, but not if it happens anywhere near them. These people are selfish and blocking the progress everyone else wants. Well, that's a satisfying story. NIMBYs make a great villain. It's easy to understand. It's mostly wrong. Imagine your town needs a new road. Everyone agrees congestion is a problem. You yourself spend several hours a week sitting in traffic. When the proposed route is announced, though, it goes slap bang right through your garden. Would you object? Yeah, probably. Is that a fair complaint, or is that NIMBYism? The answer is kind of both.
Both is good.
You agree that the road needs to exist. You also happen to be the person who experiences the biggest downside from where it's being built. Increasingly, researchers challenge the idea that resistance to new projects is only caused by people wanting them built somewhere else. One study looking at more than 16,000 people living near energy infrastructure found no statistical evidence that opposition was simply explained by people living close to the works. Instead, support was influenced by trust, perceived benefits, environmental concerns, and whether people believed the process was fair. People weren't automatically against infrastructure just because it was near them. They raised valid concerns. A person can support renewable energy but object to a wind farm because they're worried about the landscape or feel they have no say in where it's put. They may agree their community needs more housing but are uncertain about whether existing roads, schools, and healthcare services can deal with more people. They might back a new airport but object to flight paths being over their homes. The issue is that infrastructure benefits everyone as a whole, but it's a nightmare for the people living next door. They have to deal with the disruption for years, sometimes decades. The research has shown that trust is a really big element of that. People don't only judge the project, they judge who's behind it. They consider whether they believe the promises being made. They question if the construction impacts will be managed, and they think about if the benefits will actually arrive. You're asking people to sign up to a significant amount of upheaval. If people believe the process is fair and the team behind it are acting in good faith, they're more likely to accept it. But if they feel ignored, misled, or excluded from decisions, opposition can grow and quickly. It's important to remember that these aren't just sites on a map. They're people's homes, their communities. Where you live can be a really big part of your identity. With housing especially, some objections are more about who is moving in, not what's being built. Researchers call this place attachment. People form bonds to where they live, and when those places change, people understandably start to resist. None of that makes every objection correct. We still need to build, but it explains where the resistance is coming from. Now, as we look at a railway in the UK, an airport in Australia, an expressway in Kenya, and an encouraging story from Denmark, we will see that whilst there are different projects in different countries, the fundamental problems are the same. As we go through these case studies, ask yourself the same 4 questions each time. Who benefits? Who pays? Who gets to say, and whether the people leading it can be trusted. Take HS2 in the UK. Depending on who you ask, it's become a symbol of everything that's wrong with British infrastructure. Some people see it as an essential investment in rail capacity, others see it as an expensive mistake. However, if you look at why communities became so hostile to the project, the engineering wasn't the main issue. The Independent Residents Commissioner criticised HS2 Limited's community engagement during construction. Reports documented poor communication with residents, confusion over road closures, maps that weren't always updated clearly, and complaints that continued to rise as construction progressed. In one widely reported incident, an ambulance was delayed because of a road closure that emergency services hadn't been properly informed about. You could argue that each of these instances is relatively small, but that's exactly the problem. Trust isn't usually lost in one dramatic moment. It's eroded gradually through hundreds of small interactions. Every miscommitment or unexpected disruption reinforces the feeling that local people are expected to quietly tolerate whatever happens next. That lack of trust eventually spilled out beyond individual complaints. Local authorities challenged aspects of the project in court. Residents' groups became increasingly organised, and what had started as a disagreement over a railway became arguments about transparency and whether communities were genuinely being listened to. However, there's also a lot that HS2 got right. Part of the reason costs spiraled as much as they did is because of listening. An expensive tunnel extension to protect a bat population, miles of extra tunnelling to preserve the Chilterns landscape, and a whole team dedicated to managing consents, several redesigns driven by cost concerns, and some of the reasons why it became Britain's most expensive railway are because they took local concerns seriously. It can be a challenge whatever you do. Listen too little and you get an ambulance stuck at a road closure. Listen too much, too late, or without a framework for saying no, and the bill for good intentions can spiral just as fast as the bill for bad ones. Now, there's so much more that went into HS2, and we'll come back to it as a case study in future videos, but by and large, it's a political failure, not an engineering one. Western Sydney Airport tells a different story. Unlike HS2, there has been broad acceptance that Sydney needs additional airport capacity. The site itself was identified in the 1970s, and many residents recognised that a growing city would eventually need another major airport. The controversy wasn't over whether the airport should exist, it was about decisions made later. When draft flight paths were released, communities discovered that some aircrafts would be flying far lower and more frequently over residential areas than they had expected. Residents complained that some of the communities most affected hadn't been properly included in earlier consultations, while some local councils argued that they'd been excluded from important engagement processes altogether. Research into infrastructure projects consistently finds that people are willing to accept outcomes they don't particularly like if they believe the process was fair and gave them a real chance to influence the result. Even projects with clear public benefits can generate intense opposition if people feel decisions have already been made behind closed doors and the consultation was just a box-ticking exercise. Nairobi's Expressway highlights yet another dimension of the same problem, in particular, who pays and who benefits. The expressway has reduced journey times for many motorists travelling across the city, but critics argued that the project served a small proportion of Nairobi's population. Most commuters don't drive, they either walk or rely on matatus, the city's privately owned minibuses, yet thousands of residents were displaced during construction. The main argument was that the people making the biggest sacrifices were the least likely to benefit from the finished road. That led some critics to describe it as a road for the rich. In 2024, nationwide protests against tax hikes broke out across Kenya, and protesters tore down the expressway's fencing at one of its toll stations, treating it as a physical symbol of everything they were angry about. Infrastructure projects are judged by people very differently depending on where they stand. A national government may see reduced congestion and economic growth, a community may see a faster journey to work, someone whose home was destroyed for the projects sees the loss of everything they've built. Different groups aren't arguing about the same thing, which is what makes these conversations so emotionally charged. Infrastructure always has winners and losers, and we do communities a massive disservice to pretend otherwise. However, it's important we consider whether the trade-offs are fair. Not every story ends that way though. Denmark's approach to community-owned renewable energy is one example. Since the early development of wind power, many Danish communities have been involved as participants in energy projects. Projects such as the Middelgronen offshore wind farm near Copenhagen were developed with a cooperative ownership model where local residents could buy shares and benefit financially from the project. This doesn't mean community ownership removes all opposition. A study of Denmark's national co-ownership scheme surveying almost 2,000 people found most of the people who bought shares already supported the project before they invested. People who were against it largely didn't buy in at all. Ownership didn't turn opponents into supporters. It did, however, reward the people who were never going to object in the first place. Nevertheless, co-ownership shifts the conversation away from a company wants to build something here and we have to accept the consequences to this is something we are helping to create and we also share in the benefits. As we've said a few times throughout this video, people are not opposed to change itself. They are opposed to feeling like that change is being imposed on them by organisations that will receive the benefits whilst they deal with all the costs. Community ownership is not a solution that works everywhere. A railway line or a motorway can't easily be turned into a cooperative, though a growing number of community bond schemes and local benefit funds are trying to borrow the same logic. Successful infrastructure requires more than technical approval. It requires people to believe they are part of the future being built. So why do we keep getting this wrong? If researchers have been saying for years that trust and fairness matter, why do infrastructure projects keep running into the same problems? Part of the answer is that meaningful engagement is much harder than it sounds. Consulting thousands or sometimes millions of people is expensive, it takes time, it slows projects down, and even when it's done well, it's impossible to satisfy everyone. Every major infrastructure project creates trade-offs, and somebody will almost always end up worse off than they were before. Another problem is that governments and developers can treat consultation as a stage in the project rather than something that continues throughout its entire life. Once the planning permission has been approved, the public meetings finished, and works on sites begin, the attention moves to the day-to-day of the design, the engineering, the scheduling, the budgets, etc. For the people living next to the project though, that's when the real disruption starts. If communication breaks down here, any trust built starts to disappear. Organisations like the OECD now emphasise continuous stakeholder engagement throughout the life of a project, rather than viewing consultation as a single planning exercise. At the end of the day, that doesn't mean every objection is reasonable. Some people simply don't want change. Some anti-project campaigns rely on misinformation or unrealistic expectations. Infrastructure projects are occasionally opposed because people genuinely would prefer nothing to happen at all. But as we've discussed, reducing every disagreement to NIMBYism also isn't helpful. Many objections are based on perfectly understandable concerns, yet once you've labelled someone a NIMBY, you've made it much easier to ignore what they're actually saying. Going forward, technology may help. Digital consultation platforms, AI tools that summarize thousands of public comments, and more transparent planning processes all have the potential to make engagement more meaningful. However, they're tools, not solutions. Better software can't fix a process that people fundamentally don't trust. In the end, you can get the engineering right and still lose the argument. The question we're always asking is, are the benefits worth the costs? And who gets to decide if they are? Infrastructure isn't built in empty spaces, it's built where people already live and work. It can be tied to family, tradition, and history. Every project changes someone's idea of home, their daily routine, or their future opportunities. Sometimes those changes are worth it, sometimes they aren't. Either way, it's rarely as simple as people hate progress or people hate construction. The next time you hear a new project dismissed as being delayed by NIMBYs, it's worth asking yourself, is this really a story about people refusing to accept change, or is it a story about trust, fairness, and who ends up carrying the burden? This is the first of 3 videos on why infrastructure is so hard to get right. The next one's about why the projects that do get approved still end up costing more than promised. Because getting people on side is only the first challenge, staying within budget, that's the next one.